So people who know how much I read are often surprised that I haven't read some particular book that they would assume a well-read person would have read. And they'll be like, wait, you read so much, how have you not read this book? And the answer is I read so much that I'm aware of hundreds, if not thousands, of books that I think are going to be worth reading, that I would like to read, that I probably will not get to a lot of them in my life already. However, there are books where I ask myself this same question, and I wanted to talk about 7 of these today, because these are all books that are pretty short, that based on what I know about them, I think they would be useful for me in some way in the moment, and yet I have kept putting off reading them. And actually, before I do that, I wanted to talk quickly about 3 books that I recently read that were, 2 of them were sort of in the same category. So one of them is actually, I've just started reading this one today. I put it on top of the pile, and I'm like, why don't I start reading this one right now? And it has been useful for me for reasons I'll probably talk about in a future video, so I'm about halfway through this one. But then, towards the end of last year, I became aware of how big of an impact the Pilgrim's Progress has had on Western culture, especially English-speaking culture, and I went and I read that, and I was like, this really would benefit from pictures, so I bought an illustrated edition after reading the regular, just text-based edition. But then I was also like, oh, this has been my white whale since I have been in undergrad, is Paradise Lost, because I struggle with verse. For some reason, I have a hard time reading verse. And I've tried multiple times to read, and I'm like, I should just go read Paradise Lost, but I'll get an illustrated edition and I'll read it. And so I finally read Paradise Lost, and it's like, oh yeah, I'm seeing the influence of Milton kind of everywhere now after I read it like several months ago. So these 2 books, Paradise Lost and The Almanack of Naval Ravikant, are both books that I read or started reading that sort of fall into this category, but I still have 7 more that I want to talk about as well. And all of these, they're short. They are also books that I know will be useful, and they're also books that I haven't read anything else by this author, because I have this thing where if I like an author, I'm often slow to read their books, but also I'm more confident that I'm going to like them. So these are all books by 7 authors I haven't read yet. In some cases, I've read the first chapter of the book, but I haven't gotten further than that. These are all nonfiction books, and I will read the introduction and first chapter to evaluate what am I going to do with this book. Is it going to be useful? So I wanted to talk about these. And the first one on my list, and I'm ranking these from most reasonable that I have not read to least reasonable. So the most reasonable of these 7 books that I have not read is Robert Sapolsky, A Primate's Memoir. And so I've talked about how useful de Waal and Dunbar have been. Sapolsky is a primatologist who comes up in discussions of de Waal and Dunbar, like in the same conversations. And I haven't read this, and it is a shorter book than some of the de Waal and Dunbar books I've read, so why have I not read it? And I like memoirs. Behind me, you see a couple of Derek Bickerton's memoirs, which were impactful on me. But I haven't read this book for whatever reason. I don't really know why. The next one, though, I do know why I haven't read it, and this is Alex and Me, which is the memoir of another animal behavior researcher, Irene Pepperberg, and I love her work, like as a scientist, and I haven't read it because I know how the story ends. I have parrots myself, and I've lost parrots at a young age. They live like a long time for animals their size, but they are also delicate, and I've met avian veterinarians who have lost parrots young. And so Alex died young from an African gray, and that is a hard ending. And so just knowing that, I keep putting this book off, even though I'm certain I'm going to enjoy it once I read it. Especially, I've mentioned Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. That is a much more difficult subject matter, and I appreciated that one, but I still keep putting this one off. And then the next one, now that I'm trying to seriously figure out how to make self-employment work, is like the Bible of people trying to make self-employment work. And it's the longest book on this list, and that's why it's low down on the unreasonableness, but I really should read it, is Tim Ferriss's 4-Hour Workweek. And don't really have anything to say about this, except I don't really like Tim Ferriss's vibes, I guess, or they put me a little bit off. And it's a longer book, even though it's a self-help book, and I go through those fast, and this would probably take me 2, maybe 3 hours at most. But I should read this one. I know I should read it, and I keep putting it off. And I will tell people, like, don't say should with books, because then you're going to feel an obligation. But I also, like, it's not should as an obligation. It should as in, I want to read it. I want the information in it. I just keep reading other things first. And then next up, this one, Conflict of Visions by Thomas Sowell, which is, so he talks about in this book the conflict between the constrained or the tragic versus the unconstrained or utopian vision of human nature and society. And I grew up sort of with people who implicitly believed the unconstrained utopian vision, and I've come to realize that the constrained vision is right. And I think part of my issue with this one is a lot of the people I grew up with really do not like Thomas Sowell, but a lot of this dislike is he is someone who writes pop economics, and there is this general anti-pop economics, anti-pop any books sort of attitude. So as I reflected on it, and then as I was editing this video, I realized I think actually the real reason that I have avoided reading Conflict of Visions is because I have a very specific stereotype of a Thomas Sowell reader, which is a Thomas Sowell reader, in my experience, is a very specific kind of libertarian who reads Chicago school economics, preaches Austrian school economics, and doesn't really seem to understand either. And it occurred to me, all of these people I've met, they don't talk about this book. They talk about his other work, especially his book Basic Economics. And based on what I understand of the constrained versus unconstrained vision, my stereotype of a Thomas Sowell reader, Thomas Sowell evangelist, is actually someone who believes in a specifically libertarian form of the unconstrained vision, which is good motivation to read this book, and also probably why I never hear these people, my stereotype, talking about this book. And so then this next writer deals with similar topics of the utopian versus constrained vision, and I'm aware of that. And one of my favorite, possibly my favorite living philosopher is John Gray, and you can see behind me Isaiah Berlin. He has a book on that. And so it's Isaiah Berlin, and this book seems like a good place to start, a book of essays. He's best known for Hedgehog and the Fox, which I have actually read the first chapter of, and again, is sort of relevant to what I want to do, but maybe less pressing. Both of these, I guess, actually go on this list, and so it might actually be 8 or 9 books, if I miscounted again, which I might well have. Let me actually do that quickly. 9. Okay. Anyways, next book on this list is, I don't know how you say his last name, but Flow, which is a well-known book on the subject of basically, that's how you're productive without burning out, is being in a flow state. And so I know the concepts, I also know I should read this book, but I keep putting it off. And then next on my list, and this one's actually interesting because this is Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. And the reason I should be reading it is because I keep telling people Charles Darwin and Adam Smith wrote a while ago, and yet they are still very readable today. And I finally read Origin of the Species like a year ago after saying that based on other people have heard. I'm like, I should now do the same thing with Adam Smith. But what I'm running into is tiny font size. And the reason I got this book is because Fingerprint Publishing, which is an Indian-based publisher, does a lot of public domain books that are decent quality, but the paper is tissue thin, and with a book of that length, I didn't want that. So I ordered a used book. This was $6, including shipping, but it ends up, oh, the text is tiny, and I don't like that. And it's interesting that it's part of the series Great Books of the Western World, because I'm going to have stuff to say on that. I've noticed I keep getting recommended on my channel a lot of people who believe in great books approaches, and I think part of that is that my approach is kind of consistent with that and the idea of liberal education, but I don't actually believe in like great books courses, and I'll have a video on that. But anyways, this takes me to my final book on the list, which is Thomas Kuhn, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And I have read the first chapter of this one, but I keep putting off finishing it, which this is vital to a lot of what I'm explaining. It's vital to, I made a New Year's resolution, and you'll see a video on that sometime soon, that is very ambitious, but I'm convinced I can do it. And part of the reason I'm convinced I can do it is because of ideas in this book that I know are in this book, and yet I still haven't actually read the book. I'm going off what other people have said about the book, and so I really should read this book myself. Again, pretty short. And this is another one where the text is tiny, and that has put me off. And I think I probably would have already read it if it had normal sized text, but I don't like reading tiny text. I also don't love reading ebooks, and so I keep putting this off because this is the version you can get, and it is tiny text. So if you look at the reasons I haven't read these, 2 of them, and they're the 2 that I most should read, I have not read because the text in the versions that I have is tiny, and I don't like reading tiny text. One of them, Alex and Me by Irene Pepperberg, I haven't read because it's nonfiction and I know how it ends, and the ending makes me sad. I should just read it. Not reading this book, I think, I originally attributed it to stereotypes of people I knew of Thomas Sowell, but I think an actual bigger factor for me is that I have had this negative stereotype of a Thomas Sowell reader. And the interesting thing is, when I think about it, the things that frustrate me about those people are exactly the kind of things that I think he might be criticizing in this book. And then These other books, I can't tell you why I haven't read Flow. Is it tiny text? Oh yeah, that one also has tiny text, so that's probably why, because I think I looked at it and I noped out, because again, tiny text. So a lot of these are just the version I have has tiny text, and I don't love doing ebooks, and so I keep putting it off. And then this one, which also looks thick, this is a collection of essays, which is why I'm counting it, even though it's not super short. And then the other ones, I don't really have any particular reason that I can point to. I guess Tim Ferris, as I said, I don't love his vibes, but from everything I've heard, the advice in this book is solid, so I should read this given what I'm trying to do. And I'll probably, one of the reasons I'm making this video is I've noticed making these videos changes my reading behavior. And once I have shown you guys these books, I think it's a lot more likely that I'm actually going to read these. Not promising which ones I'll read or when. I just think having said, hey, these are the books that I know I should read because they are relevant to what I'm doing, and they are generally short, and yet I keep putting it off. Hopefully this will motivate me, especially because 3 of them, it's just, I don't like the tiny text. And this might be a case where it's okay, well, you decide, you're going to do tiny text or you're going to read an ebook. But anyways, I'm Magpie, thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.